Pilgrimage for Brian Hall, a spiritual journey of relevance, from the ruins of Barking Abbey to Canterbury Cathedral by Lady Miller. Day 1, Saturday 25th of June 2011. As I walked through the gates of the Curfew Tower and into the grounds at St Margaret's Church, I turned to look behind me and saw my mum still sitting in her Land Rover, watching me until I was out of sight. I've always found it difficult to say goodbye to the ones I love, and this was no different. Sometimes you just don't want to let go, and no amount of hugs and kisses can ever compensate for that initial sense of loss, for someone not being there. It was a very cool morning, especially for the time of year, and I was pleased that I wouldn't have to walk through the East End of London in uncomfortable conditions. I even sensed a bit of rain in the air. Oh please God, not that, and not so soon. I thought I'd never feel like it's a good idea. I never feel it's a good idea to set off on a journey in bad weather, not unless you have to, of course. So, as I walked through the churchyard and approached the gates to the Abbey itself, I turned one last time to wave and send my love to my mum. She did the same to me, and the car pulled away. I then turned and looked upon the ruins of Barking Abbey. There was a special pleasant feeling in this place. You feel very at ease with a sense of peace. I surveyed the scene and then walked across the top of the steps leading down to what was formerly the nave. I took my backpack off and sat down. This was a point I was to start from, so I took a pen and a piece of paper in my backpack and began to write my affirmation. I think there's a lot of power in the written word. It's almost as if it's a means by which the thoughts can manifest in actuality into the physical realm, and the energy from those thoughts reside within the ink and on the paper. I think that's why I felt it was so important to write an affirmation, not only to focus my thoughts, but to harbour them in some way. And so I began. Dear Gordon, I'm just writing this to affirm why I'm doing this pilgrimage, and to thank you for taking the time to speak to me about it. I had planned to leave on the solstice, but it didn't feel right on that day. I feel much more settled now that I've spoken to you, and happy in the knowledge that I'm approaching this the right way. When I reach Canterbury, I shall say a prayer of peace and love for all of your congregation and for the people of Barking, and I shall remember this parish by lighting a candle for it. I am walking for the world in which I wish to live, a world which is not controlled by money, but is filled with peace, love and truth. I shall also walk in remembrance of Brian Hall, a man who had the courage to stand for justice in peace, no matter what the consequences it had to himself. I think that's worth remembering. May we all have that courage. All my love, Lee. I felt very well after I'd written my affirmation by the way of a letter to Canon Gordon Tarry, and I proceeded to go into St Margaret's Church and hand deliver it in the church office and to the church secretary. I then returned to my original spot and stood 3/4 of the way up the steps, looking at the path ahead of me. I was ready to begin my pilgrimage. My thoughts were focused, and I repeated the reason for it: for the world in which I wish to live, a world which is not controlled by money but is filled with peace, love and truth, and remembrance of a great man, a man that had the courage to stand for justice no matter what the consequences may have been to himself, a man whom was called Brian Hall. I said a prayer, and then I walked down the steps and forward along the nave. When I reached the gate leading out of the ruins, I turned to take one last look at the Abbey. What a beautiful place, I thought, and turned to continue. As I walked out of the parish of Barking, I crossed the River Roding and then the busy A406 before entering the Barking Road. My thoughts had started to run quite wild, and not about anything in particular, just random things. At one point I thought I should really be focusing on thinking about this pilgrimage and what it's about, and then I gave myself a chill pill and decided that there'd be plenty of time for that. So I allowed my thoughts to go where they wished. It was quite quiet along the Barking Road that morning, and I was glad. The world was giving me the feeling that it was still waking up, and it was a Saturday. And as it was a Saturday, it must have enjoyed a lie-in. I continued along the road, through the residential areas and by the shopping arcades, all the way along to East Ham and on to West Ham, whereupon I stopped just opposite Priory Road with a view of the bowling ground, home to West Ham United FC. I always loved looking at my club. It gave me a sense of nostalgia and inspiration. As I stood there, I recalled the countless times I'd walked the same path on a pilgrimage to support my team. I remembered some of the best moments I'd had at Upton Park, and one still remains one of the best moments of my life. 1998 FA Cup quarter-final against Arsenal. John Hartson scored in the dying minutes to level and take the game into extra time. What a moment. I looked at the heavens and I thanked God. And then I remembered one of the worst moments. Same game, and after the end of extra time, a boo walking down to take his penalty. You notice I said a boo walking to take his penalty, not him actually taking it. That's because everyone to a man knew that he was going to miss. Not because he was a bad player or anything, but there was just this sense that he didn't have the right temperament. Whispers of "not boo" echoed around the stadium. We knew we were out, and then he missed, and we were. It's a funny old game, I thought, as I stood there. But then I thought football could be best described as a strange one. It really seems to reflect the state of society in so many ways, the good and the bad, and it is really an amazing form of human expression, from playing it to supporting it, to observing it, to talking about it. It unites and divides in equal measure. It demonstrates beauty and is plain ugly. Some say that football stadiums are like cathedrals, and I can concur with that observation. The coming together as a mass of people, the focus of energy, the dedication and the standard to sing in unison. It's also regularly said that a club's congregation, supporters, are like the 12th man, and it's clear that there is an exchange of energy somewhere because of the focus of thought, prayer. And then I thought about the amount of time people invest in thinking about football, and I wondered how different the world might be if they chose to think about other things, like issues that really mattered, like the things Brian Hall spent his life protesting about. It's a big escapism, football, and I think that so many people invest their time thinking about it so that they don't have to think about the rest of the nonsense that surrounds and controls their lives. I know at times it's been true of me. I walked on and immediately came to the statue of another Barking man who had honour, integrity and respect, the late, great Bobby Moore. He wasn't just an exceptional footballer, he was an exceptional gentleman. Pay my respects and continued. As I carried on and just past Plaistow, I noticed a very peculiar thing heading towards me on the pavement. What is that? Some kind of tricycle? Some bloke was on a tricycle. Blimey, you don't see that very often, I thought. And then, as the bike rode towards me, I couldn't believe it. Was it? Yeah, it was. Terry. Lee, explained the bloke, who turned out to be Terry. How are you? Good, mate. And you? I replied, with a big smile on my face. Yeah, all right. Are you doing the football anymore? Terry immediately asked. Are you doing the football again? Sorry. Terry immediately asked. In a former life, I worked as a community development officer and manager for Leighton Orient, and during my time there, I set up a pan-disability football league, the Leighton League, which was for adults with learning disabilities in East London. It wasn't my job to do so, and I didn't accept any payment for the extra hours I put in to organise and run it, even though I was offered. But I just felt like it was something that I wanted to do, something that I felt needed to be done, and something that I had the opportunity and power to make happen. It was a free event with training once a week and a league tournament once a month. Terry was an adorable fellow from one of the teams that used to attend. I hadn't seen him since the last session I ever took at Orient, over 2 years before. No, mate, I don't do that anymore. Do you still go? I asked. No, it finished about a year ago. We don't go there anymore, Terry said, with a tinge of sadness in his voice. I'm sorry to hear that, I replied, and I really was. At least it lasted for a year or so after I left. At least that was something. I know that there are people out there who quite like the idea that a project might fail because they're not part of it anymore. Maybe it makes them feel needed in some way, but not me. As far as I'm concerned, successful project management means that you build something to such an extent that it no longer needs your energy input for its continued success, to the point where the project lives of the energy of its own participants, and so that it may then take on a life of its own. But the problem is the continuous struggle for funding, whereby you can end up spending most of your working hours sitting at a computer screen, searching, completing, justifying, analysing, jumping through the most ludicrous bureaucratic hoops just to get a few pounds of funding, instead of what you really meant there for, being on the ground and doing something positive in the physical realm in order to make the world a better place. Maybe that's what had happened at Orient. There just wasn't enough funding. Maybe that's what happened at Orient. There wasn't anyone to do the fundraising. And isn't that the saddest reflection on the state of our world? The fact that everything appears fundamentally to come down to the pursuit of money. That's got to change. It's nonsense. Where are you going? Terry asked, looking at my backpack. I'm walking to Canterbury on a pilgrimage, would you believe? I replied, Canterbury? That's a long way, he said, with a slightly confused expression. Yeah, I like walking, mate. How's it going with the bow team? I said, quickly changing the subject. All right, Terry replied, and I went on to ask how some of the team members were, and Terry let me know. Say hello to everyone for me, I said. Okay, Lee, I've got to go now. Good to see you, Terry responded before departing. And you, mate, I replied. With that, Terry tricycled off into the distance, and I stood and remembered all the friends I had made at the Leighton League and the experience that I'd had. They were all my friends at the Leighton League. They were not my clients or service users. They were my friends and some of the best friends I've ever made. But why did I just bump into Terry here, in this moment, and after all that time? I didn't know. But I did know that it was so good to see him and remember those times and people. The thing I find about people in terms who have learning disability is that, for me, they are the most real and genuine people alive on the planet today. In every moment, they are being true to themselves. If they have a horrible mood, then they're in a horrible mood. And if they're being loving, then the love is so pure and it comes straight from their heart. There is never anything hidden with them, and they always express their truth, no matter what, in every moment. They don't care what people think of them. They just are who they are, and they do what they do. Learning disability is my arse. They have abilities that we can all learn from, and they have so much to teach us. Imagine a world where everyone was true to themselves and did what they felt was right in their hearts, in every given moment, no matter what the consequences may be to themselves. Imagine a world where everyone did that, irrespective of what anyone else thought, and had the strength to stand for what they were and what they believed in. Imagine a world where all the people showed that courage. Imagine a world where all people demonstrated the same courage displayed by Brian Haw. I was thinking all this as I continued down the remainder of the Barking Road. And until I passed another church that was dedicated to St Margaret, I stood once more to take in the sight, as I found it so very peculiar. The frontage of the brick-built Catholic church incorporated a huge window which took the form of a pentagram. Why is pagan symbols being so blatantly displayed on a Christian building? I thought to myself. To be honest, I'd noticed it at other times in my life, but it was just that, on this day, I found it to be even more interesting. From a Christian perspective, maybe, it has something to do with Adam and the apple, I wondered. Whenever you slice an apple across the middle, you find a pentagram. And that's why the apple is sacred to pagans, after all. And I continued to think, to pagans, a pentagram is symbolic of the 5 elements: earth, air, water, fire and spirit. So then I felt curious to know how many Christians actually knew that. Whatever the reason for this pentagram being there though, whatever the reason for this pentagram being there though, it did look impressive, and it certainly always caught my eye. I headed onto Canning Town and then across the A13 before making my way towards the Isle of Dogs and getting my first complete glimpse of the financial centre, which is Canary Wharf. Then something suddenly struck me. My pilgrimage was also about the world I wished to live in, a world that was not controlled by money. And here I was, walking adjacent to the British Cathedral of Money. I honestly hadn't thought of that before when I was planning my route. The Isle of Dogs was just a means by which to get to the Greenwich Foot Tunnel, and the Greenwich Foot Tunnel was just a means to get across the River Thames on foot. The symbolism of this hadn't registered with me until now. I immediately thought, now this is the place to focus, and so I did. All the way along, from my crossing of the River Lee to my approach to the Island Gardens, I kept my eyes and my attention on the skyscrapers which made up the Canary Wharf complex of buildings, and all the while I sent out my thoughts for the world in which I wish to live, a world which is not controlled by money. Come on then, your control is going to be broken. You will not succeed in controlling us any longer. Humanity is standing up, and we shall not surrender. My heart is more powerful than anything you have ever encountered, and I shall prevail. You will be toppled. You're going down. Yep, that's what I was thinking all the way along. I don't know what difference I made to the world, but I felt very in the zone, as we like to say in sport. I was facing up, I was squaring up, I was standing up. At least that's how it felt in my head and in my heart. There's a point as you walk along the stretch of the Isle of Dogs, the island of Dogs, where you cross one of the entrances to the former docks and you see the building which is named Number 1 Canary Wharf, in between the twin towers of two other buildings occupied by banks. And if you then turn 180 degrees, you see the Millennium Dome across the water of the River Thames, exactly opposite. Whenever I travel this way to go to Greenwich, I always look both ways as I cross this point, because the alignment fascinates me, and I always know what seems to be a pyramid at the peak of the complex. On this day, my point of view reminded me of when I was in Washington DC in 1994. When I was 19, I travelled right around America through 28 states. I really did encompass it and discovered that the United States of America is not really a single country at all, but rather a collection of smaller countries. And at the end of my trip, I visited the Washington Monument. I remembered that at the bottom of the Washington Monument, there was an information board explaining the history behind the building of it. It explained that there was a competition for the design of the monument to commemorate George Washington, and there was a handful of design entries shown. What I couldn't believe at the time was why on earth this monstrosity before me had been chosen, when I thought there were a couple of other entries that looked quite aesthetic and pleasing to the eye. I didn't understand. I then chose to go up the monument and have a look out from the top. So I paid my entrance fee and entered the lift to ascend. As the lift was going up, I had the strangest feeling, the strangest intuition in fact. I felt like I was going up the inside of a huge cock. I swear it's true. And I have to say that I felt extremely uncomfortable. When I got to the top, I had a look out from the viewing window and saw down before me the long reflecting pool and, in the distance, Capitol Hill. I remembered thinking how much the US Capitol building reminded me of St Paul's Cathedral in London, and then I just felt so uncomfortable that I wanted to come down. That was even stranger because I usually love so much to be up in high places and taking in views. I always seem to linger longer than I should in places like that because of some kind of childish excitement. The thing is, since those days I've learned that the Washington Monument is in fact an obelisk, like many used to commemorate the war dead around the world, and an esoteric symbol of masculine energy. And so it literally is a big cock. I've also learned that domes represent feminine energy in esoteric symbolism, and so as I stood there I thought how much Number 1 Canary Wharf looked like an obelisk, and if it were, then it'd be the biggest one in the world. Then I turned around again to see the O2, the Millennium Dome, the biggest dome in the world. Was this by esoteric design or just by coincidence? I didn't know the definitive answer, but I do think it's interesting and very strange. And what I did know was that there was no justifiable reason for spending £1 billion on a big dome, and then to leave it empty for a number of years. I looked at the dome and I thought that people that govern us are mental cases. And then I thought to myself, that was an observation that Brian would probably agree with. I smiled to myself. Now, it was just at this point, and just as I left the place to head onto Island Gardens, that I began to realise that I had a problem. My heels were starting to feel a bit sore and were sticking to the inner sole of my shoe. The day before I left, I was up in my mum's loft and I came across the pair of shoes I was given to work in when I was on a kibbutz in Israel during 1995. They were made in Israel and were the shoes I travelled around the Middle East in after I finished my 3 months on a kibbutz as a volunteer. I was wearing them when I travelled to the Sea of Galilee, Jerusalem, the Milk Grotto in Bethlehem, and I was even wearing them when I climbed up to the summit of Mount Sinai. Well, in that moment, I had an attack of nostalgia and sentimentality, and I thought it would be quite appropriate to do the pilgrimage wearing them to Canterbury. In fact, at the time I thought it was a fantastic idea. They were quite warm, but I thought they'd be okay, and I put in a new inner sole in them. So I found a pair of not so old trainers and attempted to pull out the inner sole in order to transplant them into the working shoes for greater comfort. Unfortunately, they both ripped at the heels where they were glued. But I persevered and managed to transfer them into my old working shoes, sticking them in with double-sided sticky tape. Okay, I know what someone might be thinking now. What a worry, right? If you are, I understand that sentiment. I really do. But to be fair, they felt great. As I walked up and down in them to test them out, I had a picture in my head of the scene in Father of the Bride with Steve Martin goes into his attic after finding his 1976 tuxedo. He tries it on and declares joyously while looking at himself wearing a tight and ill-fitting suit in the mirror, it still fits. If only I'd taken heed to that fault. I always knew that the first day of walking would be the hardest and longest because I would be walking through the city on tarmac and pavement, and I had to get clear of suburbia in order to find a safe and appropriate spot to camp wild. Although it had been very cold during the morning, now it past midday, the temperature had started to skyrocket. By the time I was at Island Gardens, my feet had become quite hot and sweaty, and this had added to the sensation of my heels not feeling quite right. I had the realisation that this might actually be quite serious. I decided to stop for lunch at a picnic table in the gardens by Greenwich Foot Tunnel, and I took the opportunity to have a good look at my feet. My heels were very red, but not blistering yet, and I also noticed that the bones on both of the balls of my feet also felt quite sore. The shoes didn't seem to be supporting my feet very well, and even though the inner sole felt good at first, the very slight blemish in the padding under the heel was rubbing. To add, the fabric which stuck my double-sided sticky tape to the ripped padding of my double-sided sticky tape to the ripped padding of my heel inner shoes had worn loose, so exposing the sticky tape to the heel of my sock. This consequently allowed the stickiness to penetrate the thin secret socks I was wearing, meaning that with every step the heels of my feet had not only been rubbing on the ever so slight blemish of the ripped padding, but were also being stuck to the padding, then ripped off, then stuck once more, etc. during the continuous action of walking. So by the time I'd reached Island Gardens, you can understand the reason for the redness of my heels. Okay, I'm going to have to digress slightly, just to sort this foot business out, and once and for all, because looking back, it most definitely appears to me like a muppet decision that I made while modernising my choice of footwear, because I know that there is a high probability that there are some people reading this who may be working their way through the entire vocabulary of rudimentary insults and have probably just arrived at you plonker for not taking the subject of foot care seriously enough. They could be right, of course, but for the record, know that they're wrong. You see, I've hiked all around the world, long distance and short, in all types of terrains and environments, from jungles to deserts, from wetlands to mountains, and all the time, and in all those experiences, I've never ever had a serious problem with my feet. The odd blister around my little toe and the occasional one on the back of my heel, but nothing too dramatic, and nothing that caused any kind of pain I couldn't ignore. And that's why, during the summer months, I walk with thin secret socks. They let my feet breathe, and if they get wet, then they're able to dry out quickly. I reiterate, I've never had a problem. What's that I hear? Gasp with members from the Serious Cycling Association, whose advice would simply be you should wear thick socks and plenty of them. Okay, I understand that sentiment, and to be fair, and it's a fair comment, but in the words of my sadly passed yet great Aunt June, a proper barking lady if there ever was one, and someone who always said things as they exactly were, you do it your way and I'll do it mine. Alright, I love that phrase. So, digression over, here I was 2 hours into my pilgrimage, sitting on a public picnic table in Island Gardens inspecting my feet, thinking, oh bugger. I repaired the problem with the inner sole as best I could, pulling the fabric back over the heel of the padding and sticking it underneath this time, and tended to my feet by pouring water over them, drying them with a clean tissue and then applying some Savlon. After that I washed my hands, hey, I'm not a barbarian, and proceeded to have lunch. It was beautiful sitting there in the shade, looking at the picturesque view across the Thames towards Greenwich. It's such a charming scene, and when you look out across the water to the old Naval College buildings and beyond to the hill in Greenwich Park, everything appears to be perfect with the world. At least that's how I feel. You could lose hours there just watching the world go by. I have a great affection for places like that, but not today. I had to keep moving. Right, I'm going to finish that section there, and I know I went a bit into it with foot care and feet, and partly the reason is that I am totally thought I was a plonker. But if it never happened, the pilgrimage would have been completely different. But also, I'm putting that in the book because just in case there's people who've not hiked before and want to do something like this, the pilgrimage. Just really think about all your equipment, you know, and especially foot care is always so important, you know, when you're walking or in the army. Look after your feet, you know, first thing you're told. Yeah, so that's why I went into it. I just got a chance to explain that one there, but no, some people have said when they read it, well, I didn't think much of it, but I think it's important. Anyway, I'm going to finish that here for now. Lots of love, and God bless you, Brian.